Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 6th episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to have you with us. We're all here just enjoying the fact that it's mid-September and not, midsummer and burning to death quite so much, but we'll see. Although Oriana and I were, of course, exchanging weather stuff. Let's not talk about the weather, however, this time. Let's talk about other things and all that. So how does the end of the year planning kick in for you guys? Because, I've already figured out sort of like, okay, I've got there's a family vacation that's coming up, and then there's other things. Do your schedules get accelerated as we hit September, or what happens with you all? Maybe the sigh says it all.
Oh, I'm actually tabling at a convention this fall, so October is going to be fun.
Which convention and where?
Geek Girl Con in Seattle.
Woo!
What dates?
Good question. November, I want to say 16th and 17th.
Oh, okay. That is good to know. Well, I just wanted to say, before we plunge into things, we have only a short news item to talk about this time, but really we want to say to all listeners out there, thank you, because we've been getting a lot more comments since the last episode dropped that I've seen in the wild, for lack of a better term. It's been really nice to see that people are saying that they've feedback saying that they really enjoyed the podcast, how we do things, just responding to stuff we brought up. That is really wonderful. I know one person on Twitter out there, Karen Cross, really loved Oriana's description of Celeborn as a purse. So, I think we have some, new merch right there. Celeborn converted into a purse, or Celeborn on a purse. That could be a representative, I'm sure. So, and all that. But we just wanted to thank everybody. I don't know if you guys wanted anything more to add to that among top of the other comments that we've seen already.
Yeah, that's great. Please let us know. I crave attention and adulation. So please.
Positive reinforcement.
Please keep it coming. All I want is for everyone to like me all the time, to rip off of John Mulaney.
I knew I'd heard that somewhere.
Yep.
It'll be a good thing. And we do want to emphasize, this is something we keep mentioning on and off. There is our show contact information and the in the outro to each episode if you want to reach out to us. And we do want to emphasize again, ratings for the show on iTunes or elsewhere, always welcome. And by all means, just let us know if there's anything in particular you think could be a fun topic. There's certainly things we can get ideas from for that. And of course, there's the Patreon for megaphonic.fm if you would like to support the show and join in the discussions that happen through the Slack that we maintain for Patreon members. Again, you'd be more than welcome. So there's all we have to say about that. But right now, let's just plunge into this episode's edition of the news. So, Jared, take it away.
So the past few weeks have been pretty quiet on the Tolkien estate and Amazon adaptation fronts, except for one thing. Variety reported that Will Poulter has been cast for a role in the adaptation. He's a young actor from the UK who's been in a variety of genre efforts, including Eustace in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and a role in the Maze Runner films, which I haven't seen. More recently, he was in Black Mirror Bandersnatch, that, choose your own path thing on Netflix, and Midsommar. So there's no word about what he's playing, not even a character name, but he looks like a school bully to me. So
Well, that's like, is he an elf? I could see some kind of an elvish bend to his feature. I don't know.
I don't know.
The eyebrows are a little elvish, I guess. There's some pretty fierce eyebrows.
That is true.
Very important. He does seem to, I mean, maybe backing up a bit. This, unlike Markella Kavanaugh, who again has been announced to play, allegedly someone named Tyra, whoever Will Poultice is playing, and all that, Poulter, Poultice, confusing the names. Yeah, we were joking earlier when the news broke that Poulter fans would be called Poultices because, I mean, why not? So we'll run with that. Will Poulter is that, having caught him here and there in various things. I mean, I'd completely forgotten about the fact that he was Eustace, for instance, until I was checking stuff. It's sort of like, okay, he seems like an accomplished enough English, I don't want to say journeyman actor. He's still kind of young to be sort of like determine like what the level is, but he's done stuff. And on the one hand, I think that's, good. And I think actually working with, yes, I said actually, I think working with relative unknowns is kind of good in the sense of it's not so much the stars as it is the overall story. And there's a lot you can do with that. And of course, we've seen how ensemble casting for adaptations has worked very well indeed. But yeah, I mean, there's a weird. It's hard to say. I mean, it's interesting that this news is sort of coming out in dribs and drabs, but it kind of would be nice to get a little more focus by now. Maybe it's still too early days. I don't know. What do you think, Oriana? Should we be surprised by the fact that we haven't heard still all that much? Or
I am a little surprised with a production of this size that it hasn't been a concerted rollout of kind of big announcements, because when you have, like, I know that a lot of this has been breaking because of, presumably agents are leaking information to try and get better contracts or that sort of thing. That whole game is clearly what's being played. But because we have no information about the story or the characters, it's difficult to make any kind of. And, who cares? Why does anyone need our judgment, I guess, on how well an actor could fit a role, possibly. But it is a little intriguing to me that we have had so little information come out, even in the midst of casting. It's a little surprising to me, and it's. But what are you going to do, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, we had a joke in private chat a couple of weeks ago that the whole idea of what this series is about is a complete head fake, and this is going to be something more like set in Second Age Bree. It'll be like Deadwood or Gunsmoke or something like that, and just everyone will be the regular cast of characters around the proto prancing pony, and meanwhile people will just come through and do cameo roles, and everyone else is just sitting there. So, yes,
I
go.
I want that.
Yeah, I want that too. It's not going to happen, but I want that.
Deadwood, but Middle Earth.
Chetwood. It's right there. The Chetwood.
The Chetwood. Yes, Chetwood. Oh my God.
You see, why aren't we the writing team?
Why? Yeah, wait. Well, we don't even need to, like, they can do the whatever they are doing now. But as a spin-off, hello, we're right here. Like,
yeah, special web series only. I mean, we've got it set out for you. Contact us.
Yeah, you could do. I like little, 15-minute episode. Who doesn't love a 15-minute episode of non-television set? The Chetwood, the Second Age. Oh God, what have we gotten ourselves into?
Very specific audience, but they're out there. So,
Right.
So we'll yeah. So in any event, that's all the news we had. I honestly thought, as we mentioned last time, we'd have a lot more news by now, but looks like it's still sort of slow going, but we'll see what the next month brings us. So for the moment, we'll just wrap up there, and it's now time to move on. Jared takes the lead this episode. It's his turn to lead talk on the main topic.
Let's talk about friendship.
Yay, friends!
Yay! Which I think is a really interesting aspect of Tolkien's, whole legendarium. I mean, they're all about a lot of things, but a lot of the events that happen are sort of defined and moved by male friendships, but in a really interesting way. I want to say this is not a shipping episode. Not that we couldn't do one, but I think you can have perfectly valid romantic interpretations of the various male relationships, but I think it's really sort of rich and interesting to read them solely as what the author says they are, because it's such a beautiful picture of these sensitive, emotionally open friendships that you don't get from a lot of other media, other franchises, other whatever. Let's take Sam and Frodo as an example. at the beginning, I think it's fascinating how they're pretty much just master and servant. Like in the early Hobbiton chapters, Merry and Pippin are given way more prominence. They're his friends, and Sam's just like his gardener. They're sort of affectionate, like jokey relationship, but that's it. And then by the end, they're pretty much on equal footing. And to me, there's this kind of the defining relationship of the book. Like it doesn't even end until they are separated. And there's this recurring theme throughout Tolkien's work where these huge deeds are done from romantic love, as we've talked about with Beren and Luthien and all that. But a lot of the others are just like, this guy's my friend. I'm going to rescue him from Morgoth or carry him up a volcano or make sure he gets enough water. And this sort of emotional fulfillment that they find in each other is really lovely to me. To me, a lot of portrayals of male-male friendship in modern media kind of revolve around the distance between them. Like if you look at Marvel, for example, and I do like Marvel, I'm not picking on Marvel, but male friendships are sort of pulled apart, like, Bucky and Captain America, or they argue with each other about pointless things and joke with each other sarcastically, and they make big decisions very seriously with each other, but there's not that same kind of emotional attachment there. And I know Marvel is doing something very different from Tolkien, but it lacks that sense of these people actually enjoying being around each other. There's like hangout scenes, but that's it. Like it's not the same. And I do like the way Tolkien does it. And it is also sort of fascinating to me that a lot of these characters are together because they swore an oath or because Gandalf is punishing them. Like Sam, like they're like say, I don't know, students at Oxford forming a club or soldiers going off to war. So they make of that these beautiful friendships. And not to like monologue for too long, so I'm going to sort of wind up for a second so you guys can talk. But to me, one of the most important lines in all of Tolkien, and we all know it, it's famous, is when Frodo and Sam are on Mount Doom, everything is over, and the mountain is coming apart around them, and Frodo just says, "I'm glad you're here with me." And that's... I'm sorry, I'm getting a little emotional now. It's not like... It's a way of saying, "I love you," in a very friendship sort of way.
But not in a not gay kind of way.
No. I just think, to me, if you're like a diehard Frodo Sam shipper, to say that only romantic love is capable of this kind of grand, epic friendship, this grand, epic attachment, this emotion that drives you, is to sort of diminish both friendship and romance. So, yeah, you could read it as romantic. I definitely don't not. Or with Legolas and Gimli. I don't know. Yeah, okay. Again, not a shipping episode. But I just like that you can read it on multiple levels. And one of those levels is just, man, they're such good friends that they would, like, die for each other, give each other the last sips of water, or, like, carry each other up mountains. And it doesn't have to be anything other than that. Anyway, yeah. I'm glad you're here with me.
We're happy to be here. So, Oriana, you want to?
Well, that's, both of you guys, I feel like I'm much more interested in your perspectives as a straight dude and a gay dude. I have known, that is one thing that I, it's like girl privilege in a weird way where we all, we're
one topic you can't speak.
Well, no, I really love, you're totally right, Jared, as usual. But in your assessment of it's okay to have friends that you would die for, that you would do anything for, that you would live for, even, that's a certain amount of sacrifice as well. And I feel like in our culture today, there is this the two are kept very, very separate.
Yeah.
And that I don't think that's a good thing, and it is remarkable to me that was it just different in Tolkien's time, like in his prime, where were men more allowed to share their friendship, their guy love, to borrow from Scrubs, I guess, not to borrow from Scrubs, but that bond between.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. This is actually, unintentionally a perfect shift into my first point I was going to bring up. This is something I had meant to do as a bit of research beforehand, but my understanding in a very broad sense is that, and we've used the term before on the podcast, homosexuality, the idea that this connection between men in a not explicitly romantic or sexual context, but is something that is more than friendship as is seen today, I guess is the best way to put it. And this is something that emerges in both the fictional and arguably the nonfiction of the time. And let's say, for time's sake, we are talking about late 19th, early 20th century, late Victorian and the Edwardian era, which is essentially when Tolkien grew up, is the best way to put it. And this can be seen in various different contexts and various levels. And again, we're obviously talking about England here specifically, granted. But if you want a classic fictional level, there's the casual mention in something like, say, in Arthur Conan Doyle's incredibly popular Sherlock Holmes stories, of course, where at least there's more than one mention of points where Watson, as the teller of the tale, talks about how he and Holmes are walking back to their 221B arm in arm, very casually. And that's something that would be read much differently now than it would be read then. And there's more research and there's more about this out there. And it's the type of thing I don't want to just simply, opine about it without something more concrete. But it's the type of thing I've encountered casually in just studies and reflections of the period. If we tie it into Tolkien's own biography, and I think this is very much key, there's a real strong sense, and I'm paraphrasing Humphrey Carpenter from the official biography here, is that he clearly felt much more comfortable with a tight circle of male friends. That was pretty much where he wanted to be. His wife Edith was his wife. But that was apparently the only in-depth female relationship, you could say, that he had for most of his adult life. He certainly had, people whose opinions he appreciated who were relatives and who were colleagues in a broad sense. The illustrator Pauline Maines is a good example of someone for whom he was on a good creative level, back and forth with, and her work is worthy of study for sure. But in terms of the circles, I mean, things like the Inklings, the various earlier societies he was involved with, that for him felt very much like home. And I think that dynamic ultimately is inescapable to a large degree in Tolkien's work.
Yeah, that's one thing. I mean, as much as I like to rhapsodize and romanticize about male friendship in Tolkien, as I just did, it is a large part of it is driven by Tolkien just like not knowing how to be friends with women. So he ended up finding a lot of fulfillment in relationships with men that if he had lived maybe in a slightly different era or been more comfortable with women, he wouldn't have maybe relied on as much. Maybe.
Well, I'm interested from you guys' perspective. Again, like I have so many options when it comes to positive representations of female friendships to choose from. Did the Lord of the Rings or did the Tolkien legendarium help you guys in creating and sustaining male friendships at all?
As a kind of positive role model.
Yeah, or was
saying.
it,
So,
or
a potential
did
role
society, the way that our culture exists, just is that force too strong?
I mean, speaking strictly for myself, I don't think consciously, potentially unconsciously. But even then, I think there's the fact that as much as friendship is sort of a key thing, I mean, quite honestly, there's the part of me that appreciates Bilbo Baggins as a classic example of a confirmed bachelor totally on his own.
Yeah.
As someone who lived in a solo apartment situation for almost a full decade in the 2000s, I frankly got very used to that. I was thoroughly comfortable with myself. So it's one of those cases where, even though I've had roommates before, and of course now I live with my partner, having that sense of solitude is kind of as is described in such a rhapsodic way in its own right, I guess is the way to put it. Although in the context of the story, of course, the idea is that it's not the story of Bilbo sitting around; it's Bilbo getting out there and getting to meet friends, companions, people who he ends up being able to banter with Gandalf, essentially. That's a rare privilege. And there's that sense that informality, you could argue, is very key. And we see that in very interesting points throughout the entire story. And by that I mean the entire Lord of the Rings in particular. For instance, when it's Pippin greeting Aragorn sort of very casually and comfortably after the Battle of Pelennor Fields, and everyone's kind of surprised at how it's sort of like,
do they speak
okay.
to kings as such? Yeah, I think it's Yorith, or it's maybe one of the captains of the guard or whatever, who is like, do they speak to kings as such in far off lands, when Pippin is like, Strider, what's up, man?
Yeah.
I'm going to take that moment too, since I've gone ahead and brought up something set in Minas Tirith that I was thinking earlier today, and I think this is a relevance to Jared's points that he's brought up. And there are a couple things I want to get back to as well. I don't want to let them escape me. But something that I think, using Pippin is a very good example, besides the, of course, friendship that Merry and Pippin have, and all that, which, of course, is very much its own sort of key thing. There's that wonderful sequence. And again, it's not something that emerges in many of the adaptations, although I think it did turn up in the radio version of the U.S. radio version of Lord of the Rings at some point. And that is where Pippin's essentially on his own and needs someone to talk to. And he ends up becoming friends with both Baragon, I believe his name is, the fellow who's in the guard, and his son Burgle, if I remember right, or is his name. And I like how there's this time taken in this big overarching story about what do you do when you're on your own, you're just trying to sort of like, there's that part where Pippin sort of confesses to himself that he feels lonely and he thinks he'll speak to this stranger just so he has someone to speak to. And that in and of itself is not merely friendship, but just the idea of connection. But then this person turns out to be so just very friendly and generous, and then he also ends up speaking with his son later, and it's this nice little vibe of something like, oh, okay, it's a nice story element, and nice is kind of doing a lot of heavy lifting there, but it's warm, I guess is the best way to put it. It's very open. It's very sort of, the pressure's all around, and yet there's this happening in this particular moment right there. And there's a happy ending in the end with that particular story and arc. And I just like that because I really do think there's a case of Tolkien showing how these moments matter. How something like that can matter. We hear all the time the idea of, reach out to somebody and things like this and make sure someone's not isolated in a weird sort of way without trying to draw some sort of moralistic lesson for the present here. I'm just merely noting that Tolkien seems to have had a very good eye for how a initial friendship or initial sort of good connection can develop. And I think he's good at capturing a moment like that, in as much as he's also good at showing moments of very long established friendships indeed. So
yeah. I do have to interject to say I started fanning the thing that I'm drawing for this episode with a book that happened to be nearby. And the book is A Spring Harvest by Tolkien's friend, Jeffrey Bucksmith. So, yeah, I started laughing. I think Oriana saw me.
I did. I was like, I gotta know what that's about.
Yeah, it's just the book that his friend wrote. So speaking of friendship, his friend wrote and then died. And on his deathbed, wrote to Tolkien. Nobody else but to Tolkien. And was like, I forget what the note said, but it's in the movie that we watched, the biopic. And Tolkien just goes home, and then one of the first things he does in England after leaving World War I is get his friend's book of poetry published.
That's true friendship right there, is getting your dead friend's poetry published.
And it was and I think it's good to bring up the context of the war and loss, because there was so much loss, and there was a strong sense of the strong sense that there were so many people now gone that collecting these things, remembrances of what the work they had. And I'm thinking broadly. We're thinking of all the famous poets, of course, but also ones maybe not so famous like this, and artists and other things. There's so many examples and books out there. This idea of how do you memorialize those who've gone? How do you honor those friendships that happened? And I think that's very, very vitally important for sure.
Well, I mean, that's probably a whole episode on its own, how the war would have shaped his view of friendship and all of this. Because he famously wrote something like like 5 of us went to war and only I returned, something like that. I'm really paraphrasing. That is not it. It sounds better when he says it. But it was something like that, where all of his friends died, and then he had to go back to England and start from zero.
Very true.
So.
And bringing up the movie is a good example. Sure, it's the movie. We're talking again about the Tolkien biopic that came out earlier this year. Is that for all that, I had various issues with it. We all did in our own ways. I thought it, if the theme of it was to try and show that friendship has a deep role, then however much it wasn't, the historical story, I thought it did a reasonably good effort with that. And I thought it was suggestive at points. And I know you and I, Jared, were sort of thinking about this, about how at one point it's from his friend, the one who's featured, who does, who they specifically feature, who does pass on and write that final letter. How there's a moment where it's kind of interesting. It feeds into sort of what we were talking about earlier. It could be read almost as not quite a romantic declaration, but there was very much a sort of vibe happening. It was a scene set in college at Oxford, and I thought it was actually rather well handled. It was just one of those things like, okay, you can read it one way or another, but I think it sort of speaks to those kind of emotional depths that could be reached in such context, given the hothouse of college too, granted, but even so.
Yeah, oh, that's a whole other thing too, is the British school system, and anyway... Don't know enough about that to pontificate, but I will learn, specifically so I can pontificate.
So here's a question back to Oriana. I was racking my brain. Is there anything like a female friendship in Middle-earth at all?
There's not, like, the only real hint that we get of any kind of female friendship is Melian and Galadriel, I feel like. And that is genuinely only a hint. Like, it literally just says... Galadriel thought she was cool and hung around for a while. And that was it.
I mean, oddly enough, it just sort of occurred to me that between the last few episodes, we maybe have touched upon the only moments in general, because there is a bit of it in Eldarion and Arendis, a hint between Arendis and the Queen, for instance. But this is all in a family context, and there are some other things there. But yeah, it's kind of so. I guess maybe a question for you is that alienating in Tolkien for you or not?
Weirdly, I don't find it alienating. I think because I have been experiencing, but well, maybe that was why I wasn't great. Not why, but I was not great at female friendships until I hit college. And even since then, I have a lot of male friends, but my female friendships are extremely close and deep bonds that are very, very, very unlike my male friendships. With a lot of my male friendships, I'm kind of a therapist.
Because we're not socialized to talk about our emotions with other men.
So really, it would be great if everyone could have a Sam or a Frodo. If every dude person could have a Sam, I feel like that would be great. I would love that for them. It wasn't until fairly recently that I realized exactly how restrictive it must be for you guys. I genuinely feel really bad for you that you are not really allowed to show the depths of the emotions that you clearly have in male-only contexts. That it honestly breaks my heart. I can't imagine not telling my friends that I love them and, how much I appreciate them and hugging them and, that just feels so essential to me. And maybe that's why I didn't feel alienated by the lack of female friendships in The Lord of the Rings, is because the male friendships felt very female. I was like, oh, that's so nice. That's how I am with my friends. I get it.
This brings to mind something another thing I was thinking about beforehand. We were talking about a sort of positive case. This is not a negative case in Tolkien I'm bringing up, but I think in contrast to the supporting warmth and love, and I have more thoughts about that later. I also don't want to take over from Jared here. It's his topic and all that.
No, that's fine.
But I think it's vitally interesting to consider a deep tragic friendship that is at the heart. I don't want to say the heart, maybe, but is one of Tolkien's longest established examples, if I remember right, in terms of when it was introduced in the legendarium. And this is part of the arc of Turin Turambar in the Silmarillion, but of course dating back, of course, to 1917 and onward, one of the oldest stories. Was it Mablung or was it Beleg?
Beleg.
Oh,
it was
Beleg. Sorry.
And it was. I was about to say. I was like, wait, did I get the name wrong? And all that. And to elaborate on this, this is very crucial because, again, if you're not as familiar with the Silmarillion, a very capsule description, Turin in the Silmarillion has evolved over time. Basically, he is quite literally the character who gets no breaks because everything is basically he's on a downward spiral almost marked from birth. And there's a lot going into this about why he is such a particular tragic hero. But the thing to keep in mind is that while there are I need to keep two like key romantic relationships that end up absolutely disastrously in terms of death and depth, to put it mildly. The one that I think that shows the most trauma is what happens with Beleg. And the brief setup of the story for, again, those unfamiliar, is that Turin is a man, not an elf. Beleg is an elf. The two of them have formed a very close bond. And when Turin was being brought up by elves in the kingdom of Doriath, and after a number of adventures, they eventually form they're the head of a small group that helps sort of cleanse the land of orcs and things like that, and allow safe passage for people. And they're sort of seen as these. They're sort of like Robin Hoodish, you could argue, but on a very much more I don't want to say elevated level, but a different kind of level in this particular context. And again, it's this tight partnership between a man and an elf. What happens is that the bad guys eventually get the drop on them. Most of the band are killed. What happens is that Turin is hauled away by the orcs. Beleg recovers, chases after them, catches up with them, and I'm simplifying the story. But the key thing, what happens here, is that Beleg frees Turin and is trying to basically free him up from his bonds. And Turin, who's been in and out of consciousness, wakes up. Basically, he's been sort of tormented by the orcs as they've hauled him away. He wakes up. He now sees what he sees as a shadowy figure above him. Assumes, oh, geez, another orc and all that. And now this one's got a knife, and so wrestles with him, grabs the knife, and kills him. And kills Beleg, his very, very, his extremely close friend, who's been through many adventures with him. And what's important here in Tolkien, especially in the final form of the story, the final forms, but it was there almost from the start, if I remember correctly, that this is utterly, utterly traumatic. And the traumas that Turin faces in his story, he often vocalizes them. He often just sort of like, there's things that, he lets out. He's in rage and anguish. We see that when Finduilas, we see that when he's pursuing Finduilas. We see that at the end of his life when he realizes what he's done and eventually leads to him taking his own life. What happens when he's killed Beleg, his close friend, is he goes catatonic. He just can't react. And he doesn't react. And if it weren't for another elf who's been freed, who sort of is able to lead Turin away and eventually get him to a point where he can finally crack that grief many, many miles and many, many days later, it's the sense that he would just simply waste it away right there, because it's such a profound betrayal of friendship is what it is. And I think that's sort of the way that Tolkien portrays that is so vitally powerful. What is the worst thing you can do to a friend? You could literally kill them. You could literally kill them, and do so utterly unknowingly. You've committed a terrible, terrible crime, and you did so in complete ignorance. And I think Tolkien really is trying to emphasize in that moment just how utterly soul-shocking that is. And I think that's why this tragic friendship throws a lot of the not tragic friendships into a good light. It's sort of like, the ones where everyone comes out all right in the end. It's shaped by their experiences, but comes out all right in the end in a much better place.
Like, if I'm not feeling it, like, I will just skip that when I'm rereading, because it's just devastating.
Maybe shifting gears to another form of friendship, false friendships are very important in Tolkien, because I think for him that's one of the biggest sins. I think Sauron is the classic example. He's the one who comes in friendship. Hey, I'm the giver of gifts, And he cozens up to people and tells them lies and tells it to the elves. And then in a much different context, he does that to Ar-Pharazôn and Numenor. But we see that in a classic example is the false friendship of Wormtongue. Is someone there? He's someone who's meant to be the counselor, is meant to provide Theoden with the advice and all that. And of course, it's all false. It's not a real friendship, and I find that just very interesting too. So these examples of friendship that aren't are as important as the ones that are.
Yeah, I think that's technically honest services mail fraud in the United States. It is depriving the public of the honest services of a public official by means of fraud. Fun fact.
The legal system of Middle Earth.
Yeah, right.
Oh, speaking of, this is not related to friendship at all, but speaking of Wormtongue,
Hey,
I
go
got
ahead.
so irrationally furious the other day at this tweet that was making the rounds where somebody was making fun, why would he give somebody named Grima Wormtongue a job? Couldn't you tell from his name he wasn't trustworthy? And I was like, oh my god, you guys, that's not what he was called. That's what the people that didn't like him nicknamed him. Why?
Jeez.
Yeah, I went full Tolkien nerd for a second, and I had to step back and go, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Don't be that guy.
And of course, I yell at people going geez, in the film he looks so grungy. I'm like, that's the film.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
yeah. The film is doing something very different from the books.
Right. So, but
Anyway.
but no. I mean, good to bring up. I mean, yeah. I mean, I'm just trying to think. There are further angles to go with this, but maybe let's take it back. Let's take it back to something like The Hobbit. When it comes to Bilbo is in isolation at the start of the story. He is respected, but you don't get a sense of any close connection. And to unpack the whole essence of friendship and how that works throughout the entire story would almost be worth its own episode. But what I'd like to focus in on is what happens by the end of the story, the end of the major part of the story, not the end, although I think that's really good too, where you have Balin and Gandalf and Bilbo just sitting around Bilbo's place, and they are friends, and everyone's very comfortable and chatting and talking, and I think it's a really lovely moment. It's this change from, Bilbo the isolated to Bilbo the now much more social, a lovely, lovely element. But I think the real depth of friendship, of course, comes when we see the parting of Bilbo and Thorin.
Yeah.
And that's a scene that's a heavy scene that gets you every time for a kid's book. That's pretty sharp. That's it's wonderfully literary. Someone realizing on their deathbed what the true value of something is, granted, but it's handled very well, and it's handled from the point of view ultimately of the person who is left behind when a friendship does end. And you get a sense that regardless of the eschatology and the sense of what the future is like in terms of the afterlife or paradise within Middle Earth, that Thorin is saying goodbye pretty much permanently. He's going to his father's. He's going to their company, and has to say goodbye to Bilbo. And of course, Bilbo is overcome and weeps. This is again not the type of thing you see, to take it back to kind of what Jared was saying, not the kind of thing you often see in modern literary productions. I mean, if we want to bring up Marvel, we do have a sense of some sense of grief and loss that we saw in Endgame, but the idea was that was meant to be a very singular moment in the Marvel arc, as opposed to something like this, which is just contained within its own sole story. So I think that's the fact that he's able to do this in a story that's a kid's story, and have something on the value of friendship, as he does at various points throughout The Hobbit, is further to the strength of the story, I think, further to the strength as creator. That's not necessarily the bigger, more adult, for lack of a better term, arcs in the Silmarillion stories and Lord of the Rings.
I keep circling around modern portrayals of friendship, and I don't know, just what bothers me about them, and thinking, it's always two guys. Speaking of male friendship specifically, it's always two guys who are we hate each other at first. It's like Pride and Prejudice friendship, and they come to at the end, they're like, yeah, you're my friend, let's go shoot the bad guys or win this football game.
Right.
It's always treated as a process of learning a lesson, and there's not as many examples as in Tolkien of what a healthy friendship just looks like. just caring for each other and we don't have to learn. Sam doesn't have to learn how awesome Frodo is. Frodo doesn't have to come to accept Sam. Like, he does over the course of the book, but there's no, like, lesson moment. It's just slow, subtle character change. And I really appreciate that it's not treated as a moral, because if you treat friendship as, like, a moral lesson to be learned, then it's like, well, where's the fun in that?
Right. And it's also not, in Jared, you're right. There's all these examples of men having to learn to be friends while working together. It's seldom decoupled from that, in that, like, labor environment. They have to team up to get
setting.
Yes. And that's not great. You guys are allowed to be friends with people who are not your coworkers. You can meet each other at other places. And that's, to get Ned to go back to what you were saying about Bilbo weeping over Thorin, that is one of the things that I love about all sorts of characters in Tolkien, but Sam in particular. And this gets much more into portrayals of masculinity rather than just male friendships. But what I love so much about Sam is that he is a crybaby. He's such a crybaby, but in a good way. He is forever bursting into tears. He has no qualms about expressing his very strong emotions about all sorts of things. And I love that. Sam is the best. And that's one of the reasons why, is he'll burst into tears of joy, as soon as the minstrel starts singing the song of, the tale of Frodo.
Nine-fingered Frodo.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not treated as anything. Yeah. It's not like, it's, of course he's crying. It's treated,
I think this only makes me thinking of Frodo and Sam, kind of I don't want to say the friendship, but the one that, by default has the most time spent on it, is an interesting tiny difference in portrayal, book versus film, talking of course about Jackson's film, is the moment where Frodo is recovering in Rivendell, and for the first time that Frodo is conscious, Sam comes in and wordlessly, just strokes his hand and just almost doesn't have the words, and the conversation is sort of like, just sort of like he finally gets the words out a little bit later. And in the movie, of course, famously, Ian McKellen told Sean Astin, "It's in the book. Got to hold his hand." You got to have that, and that's shown. But the context is a little different, and yet it still works. In this case, what happens is it's just Sam comes in a rush. You're awake. You're right there, and all that. Whereas it's more an immediate sort of thing. Whereas Sam almost doesn't can't find the words in the book initially, but so it's a slight. I don't say telling difference, because I think both reads on it are perfectly great, but I really do like the detail that the book provides, where it's sort of like it's just described in a way until finally Frodo almost has to break the silence and say, "Oh, hello Sam, how are you doing?" and all that, just to get Sam to sort of say something.
I really think it was the cultural I genuinely think that they just felt they couldn't do that, and maybe it was too corny, or maybe
it is. It's unbearably sincere.
It's so sincere.
Yeah.
And we have, even production was pre 9/11, and maybe it was because production was pre 9/11, and I don't think audiences were necessarily ready for that kind of sincerity, which is, well, don't get me started on sincerity in film. It's too.
There's this great essay by this critic that I admire, Gretchen Felker Martin. She wrote this essay about seeing the Lord of the Rings movies as a young person, and I think I'm roughly the same age as her, so it would have been around the same time in our lives. And it was the first time that she had ever seen a male friendship portrayed this way on screen, with people crying over each other, or Aragorn kissing Boromir on the forehead.
Yes.
When he's dying. And just breaking down in tears over that. And that's actually, her essay is indirectly why I picked this topic, because I was like, that I hadn't never thought about it like that before. But even though the movies do pull back a little bit on some of the more overt displays of physical affection, it's still unique in the way it shows men interacting in these openly emotional ways. It's very beautiful.
And there's something, too, about how ultimately there are there are many different layers to friendship. Again, granted, male to male context almost totally in Lord of the Rings that function different ways. I mean, even in a weird way. You've got Shagrat and Gorbag there in the Two Towers, who are, are they friends? Well, no, one ends up killing the other, if I remember right. So granted, but the two of them, we're talking two orcs, two orc captains, just sort of going at each other. They're terrible subordinates, their work conditions, things like that. The type of thing that Tolkien himself was familiar with in a military context is what it is what I think he's specifically drawing from there. And it's kind of what you're talking about earlier. It's a work friendship, granted, but it's the type of work friendship where it's sort of like, geez, what are we dealing with now? And it's like, granted, they're evil characters and all the rest of it, yet there's something recognizable there. That sort of speaks to a sense of how friendship takes on very odd forms. But another thing, maybe to come back to the point about Sam too, and the sense of emotional, that is that we get a sense very early on in the story. This is before anyone's left. It's the night when Gandalf arrives and basically tells Frodo, "I got something to talk to you about." And earlier that evening, we get Sam sitting around with cronies and folks down there at the Green Dragon, and you get a sense that there's this everyone. This is a social context where it's a bunch of friends, but it's from the point of view of somebody who's sort of like, this isn't enough for me. Or some of the opinions being brought up here are kind of just like, what are you talking about? And I like that double level of it. On the one hand, Sam is exactly in the context of a wider circle of friendships, a social situation that he fully understands and is part of. And at the same time, he's just feeling a little like, this is not working. And part of it is
these are not necessarily my people, is
right. Yeah.
what it feels like.
It's this sense that something's that again ties into the wider arc of Sam. You could say that there's something more out there, but I think it's a recognition that friendships function in different ways in different contexts. It's an interesting demonstration of that. A friendship that's forms a circle of people to get together and have drinks. I don't know if it's once a day or once a week or however they do that, is not necessarily the same as people that you fully unburden things to, that you feel like they would actually respond to you in a sincere way with, which I think is interesting.
One thing we keep sort of touching on and sort of skittering back away from is the context that we're all currently in. We're all American, I think, right? None of you are Canadian, right? And the way it looks to us, I mean, we were talking about that, but like how it would have played differently in other eras or even other countries nowadays. Like, I was trying to research, I think I tweeted about this, like homosociality in Britain, like male friendship in Britain looks way different than it does here. Like, it looks way closer to Lord of the Rings friendship than American friendship. So I wonder how the book reads to other people with different definitions or constructs of friendship. How does it play? I don't know. I mean, I'm American white male. I don't know what it looks like to anybody else.
Yeah, there's something there about the idea of what translates culturally, you could say, on different levels and over time too. Yeah, it's a rich subject. The more I think about it, I suppose we've gone. Well, maybe we've reached a temporary end. I'd like to note something too, by the way, to both listeners and both of us, all of us here, is that just because we talked about a topic once doesn't mean we can't circle back on it. So there could be other times and other contexts. But Jared, maybe do you want to? Is there any sort of final word on the subject for now? You want to wrap it up with?
I played the "I'm glad you're here with me" card right at the beginning. That would have been a good ending, wouldn't it?
The sentiment remains true in there and good.
Yeah. So. No, to reiterate that, I think that is, that in a sense is just what friendship comes down to, is I'm glad you're here with me.
Okay, so for next time, I'd like to focus in on one of the more obscure yet crucial characters from Lord of the Rings, and what he represents as much as who he is. But he's utterly memorable, a figure who features in the wider unfolding of the entire story. Arguably, without his presence at a crucial moment in the narrative, the story doesn't work out as it does. And Tolkien's choice to include him in the story is a very conscious move. But he represents part of the murkiest history elements of Tolkien's legendarium, something which Tolkien did explore both elsewhere in Lord of the Rings and in unpublished writing that later surfaced in the Unfinished Tales and the History of the Middle-earth series. Beyond that, as maybe even more than a fair amount of Tolkien's imaginative universe shows, there's a strong sense of real-world assumptions, stereotypes, and both ancient and real history that leads into this character and the small society he leads. So for next time, I would like to discuss Gan Buri Gan, the Druidane, and the native peoples, for lack of a better term, of Middle-earth.
Oh my god, I thought this was going to be Tom Bombadil, but no.
That was me, Glorfindel.
Holy crap.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I'm glad I head faked you both out.
You totally did. Oh my god, that's so good.
I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, colonialism, imperialism, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah.
There is a lot going on here in a very, very small space in Lord of the Rings itself, and the undercurrents, I mean, in the other writings too. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack. There is a lot to unpack. And I just, one of those things, like a couple of months ago, I'm like, yeah, what's with this character? And
Yeah.
yeah, I don't want to spoil where I'm going to go with my thoughts on this next time. But yeah, think of this over. Needless to say, I should say, and we're all three of us are aware of this. There's a lot out there about you could say the colonial and imperialist society that Tolkien grew up in, that he himself was representation of to a degree. He was, of course, born in South Africa, and there's a lot tied up with that. There is a lot going on, and again, there's a lot more I could say right now, but I don't want to play my hand. The assumptions are not necessarily what you think when it comes to Tolkien, a lot of very particular political and social questions. It's a case where we're not talking woke Tolkien. This is not not the case, but he is at the same time, he's not quite the stereotype you might imagine him to be. It's a very interesting liminal space, is the best way to put it. And this can be seen in a variety of different areas, but I'll say more about that next time. So there's something to think about. But yeah, Gan Buri Gan. I mean, just imagining him alone, what he looks like. There's a lot to talk about there.
Oh, I get to draw him then.
Yeah.
You do, and I'm looking forward to your take.
This podcast is just an excuse for me to do all the Lord of the Rings fan art I've been meaning to do for years. That's all it is.
You know, if that's how this works out, I'm so happy. So, okay, well, we'll wrap up here. You won't hear it in the version you're hearing now, but Oriana's been having to deal with all sorts of audio flakery and things like that, and she's had to reboot a few times just so we get this done. So we're gonna wrap up here so she can go, and not suffer it again. Any last thoughts from either of you folks?
Frodo and Sam forever. Frodo and Sam forever.
Yeah, we should do a shipping episode at some point, just because there's a whole lot there. Just in terms of cultural impact, not just who's your OTP?
Yeah.
Yeah. No. I'll let whoever wants to take the lead on that, because you're more the experts than I. So, that's all I'll say. Okay, so thank you again for listening. We really appreciate it. Again, to reiterate what we said at the start of the episode, thank you so much for all the feedback we've gotten. It's really nice to know that there are people out there listening and enjoying what we do. We aim to keep at it. We will hopefully not be too self-conscious about it. We'll just keep on plugging away. Thank you again. We'll talk to you all next month. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm, or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.